Howdy, folks. So, I haven't done one of these videos in a while, and, it's been a very interesting, long, grueling year for most of us, um, myself included. And I think moving forward, I've kind of decided that I'm just going to be doing videos like this for albums that really tickle my fancy. I'm not going to be doing a video for this or like this for every single prog album that comes out or every single release that I'm a little bit excited for. This is for the big guns, the big stuff, the records that I'm like, I need to talk about. So these are probably going to be a little bit bigger reviews, a little bit more detailed, but we're not going to have reviews like the ACT one I released previously, where I don't really feel like I did that album justice. I could have done much better with that review, and I've got to be excited for the album to really have any inkling to talk about it the way I should. So, moving forward, here we go with the review for Pain of Salvation's new album, Panther.
How does it feel to be you? She once asked me. I said I feel like a panther trapped in the dark's world.
So anyone who knows me personally well knows that I'm a massive Pain of Salvation fan. I own all of their CDs, been to their show. It's actually where I met Notes Reviews. And yeah, it's just been a really incredible trip to be a fan of theirs. Now, unlike a lot of bands in the progressive metal scene, Pain of Salvation have always kind of prided themselves on doing kind of the opposite of whatever their last record was. For a long time, they just completely did these like left field experimentations with every album. And, there are a lot of bands that say they like to do something different, but when you look in the progressive metal genre, what like is coming up from bands like Dream Theater, Mastodon, and you notice there's sort of a homogenization going on in their music where every album kind of sounds identical now. Pain of Salvation somehow have managed to have a career going since, the band started in the 1980s, and they've managed to avert that sort of attitude pretty much their entire lifespan. It's incredible. But of course, you always have to sort of take whatever their current album is going to be in the context of whatever their previous album was before. And, going back through their last 3 or 4 records, you could see that there was kind of a big shift. Their first 4 albums are all very different from one another, but are also in a lot of ways sort of bog standard progressive metal. The Perfect Element Part 1 and Remedy Lane are very similar in a lot of ways. But then when you get to albums like 2003's B, which is this very broad concept album with a huge number of musical influences and styles, up to a very like nu metal, threatening sort of sound with Scarsick, up to, a very bluesy, earthy kind of sound with the Road Salt albums. And then it all sort of culminates on their previous record, 2017's In the Passing Light of Day, which was a very fantastic record that mixed the sort of emotionality, if that's even a word, of, their early albums like The Perfect Element, Remedy Lane, with sort of the more bluesy elements of their recent records, the more dark and threatening tones of like the 7-string guitar from Scarsick, and it sort of painted this really organic picture. And it left me wondering a little bit if their next album was going to be, where are they going to go from there? They've already kind of done sort of a culminating album for their career with In the Passing Light of Day, where they bring in a lot of what they were doing before. Can they bring anything new to the table? Well, with the first 3 singles, they really did seem to kind of have a very different sound than anything we were used to from Pain of Salvation. They were mixing in elements of industrial music, electronic music, which is something they've dabbled in before with like interlude tracks on Remedy Lane and Entropia, but have never really like fully explored. And these first three singles all have a very interesting sort of electronic component to them. So we start that with Accelerator, which is the album's opening track and also the first single. And it has this very, pulsating, throbbing guitar riff that goes on underneath it with this, kick drum pattern that follows it. And on top of it is layered all of these layers of synthesizers, overdubbed vocals, just other little effects going on throughout the song. I do actually feel like the first song is actually the weakest one on this record, which is kind of strange because usually Pain of Salvation albums start with a very strong song. Like their last one, On a Tuesday, was probably one of the best songs on the record, and it opened the album. Used is another really good example. The of Two Beginnings into Ending theme on Remedy Lane is yet another classic example. Spirit of the Land into Inside. Pain of Salvation album openers are usually top-notch, but I felt like this one, it did set a good tone for the record, and I'm not going to say it's a bad song, but I did feel like once you start getting into the rest of the album, it actually comes off a little lacking. And we get right into that with the next song, which is Unfuture, and Unfuture has this very, I guess you'd say it's more industrial than electronic, and you get this sort of bluesy, slide, deep acoustic guitar, and it actually doesn't sound that far off from what you might expect to have heard on their album 1 Hour by the Concrete Lake. In fact, there are a lot of little parts in this song that kind of come off a bit like The Big Machine from that album. And, it's a little bit more dark, threatening, a little bit more metal, but the track in and of itself is probably leaps and bounds better than Accelerator. And, if listening to the first track, Accelerator, is going to turn you off because of the more predominant electronic influences, Unfuture is going to bring you back and kind of remind you this is still Pain of Salvation. They still have a particular sound, and you don't really have anything to worry about on that front. Following that, we have the album's second single, which is Restless Boy. And of the three singles that the band released for this album, I would say this is my favorite one. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like Accelerator, where it only really has this one or two parts that kind of go through the entire piece. It starts with this sort of hip-hop inspired drum pattern before going into this more dark Meshuggah style territory with the riff section and these whispered vocals that are in unison with the whole rhythmic part of the track and a repeated plea that this is not a test. And it's such an odd track, and it has this it's short and it has this big build up and crescendo at the end, and this very odd rhythmic pattern that for those who maybe know a little bit about music theory, it's groups of 16th note quintuplets followed by septuplets. It's this very janky, odd rhythm that if you try to really get your body going into it, you're gonna have a bad time. But it's such an odd track. You can't help but love it. And, I really like the approach that Leo Marguerite took with the drumming on it. It's a very fantastic drum track. And especially, the more hip-hop section, which, funny enough, is an actual acoustic drum kit, just with, towels and fabric put over each drum, and to make it sound all muted like that, which is a really interesting production trick. From here, we get into what I like to call the sort of classic Pain of Salvation section of the album, with the track Wait, which is this beautiful piano-driven ballad track that kind of reminds me a bit of something off of, maybe Remedy Lane or The Perfect Element Part 1. It's a very classic sort of move with these, like, odd time signatures being thrown in, but still, like, this very cohesive sounding track. There's a lot more synth work that goes on at the end of the track, and the track does build up to more of a crescendo, but it never quite gets to that heaviness. You don't really get, like, a big guitar riff. There aren't even really... There is a solo in the track, but it's almost near the beginning of the track as an acoustic guitar part. It's absolutely beautifully played, and, I didn't really care too much for the guitar work on In the Passing Light of Day just because it was very simple. There wasn't really a lot of meat to the guitar parts, but on this album I'm finding that the guitar work is a little bit more interesting. It has a little bit more going for it. And, it's a great thing that they've been able to sort of up the ante with the guitar work, probably a result of classic era guitarist Johan Hallgren returning to the band after the departure of Ragnar Zollberg, which, that was not a very amicable departure, so, you can really feel that there was a lot of tension in the band at the time, and I guess they really wanted to have more of a triumphant thing to have Johan back in the band. Next is the song Keen to a Fault, and this one sort of continues on the same, path as Wait. It's very light compared to some of the other tracks on the album, but there's also a very, sort of heavy kind of element to it, and it's a little bit more proggy than maybe something off of In the Passing Light of Day or Road Salt. In fact, the sort of rhythmic pattern of it, like that 3/4 kind of polyrhythm, is something they played around with a lot on albums like Remedy Lane. You can hear them do the same thing in Waking Every God, which is the first thing that this track really kind of reminded me of. Now, even though this song doesn't have a guitar solo in it, the guitar work between Johan and frontman Daniel Gildenlow is absolutely fantastic. The way the two acoustic guitar parts in the track sort of interweave is just gorgeous, the way they managed to do it, and I think anyone who's a fan of classic Pain of Salvation is going to hear this track and be blown away by it. Next, we have the track Fur, which is a short sort of interlude, instrumental piece. I'm not sure what instrument that is that you're hearing on it, but it sounds to me a lot like the mandala that Daniel Gildenlow's father built for him that you can hear on the B DVD. I think there's a couple of other places where it's shown up. I think it's on Healing Now from Road Salt 2 as well. But, it has this very lute-esque quality, and the whole track has this sort of medieval kind of music thing going for it, which is really cool. Something kind of unlike what Pain of Salvation has done in the past, but still just really awesome, and it leads us into the title track of the record, which was a bit of a controversial one for the band because of the rapping in it. Now, Pain of Salvation is no stranger to sort of spoken word / rap vocals. We've heard it in songs like Used, Diffidentia, Spitfall. All of those tracks contain Daniel Gildenlow's rap vocals. And, they're used more or less the same way here. I've heard people say that it's more of a modern rap. I don't really listen to modern hip-hop music at all, so I don't really have a basis of comparison for that, but I do know that the track is, it's a little simpler than the rest of the album. It's, all just straight 4/4. The guitar work is kind of subdued. It's more in the background. There's a lot more, again, of an electronic influence, and, being the third single, along with Restless Boy and Accelerator, all three tracks have very strong EDM kind of leanings to them, you would swear that this album was going to be like a very electronic album. But as the rest of the tracks I've already mentioned show, they still kind of go for a very ballad approach, or a very, heavy guitar-driven approach, which is still very classic Pain of Salvation. Maybe the keyboard work is a little bit more accentuated than it was on In the Passing Light of Day, where keyboardist Daniel Carlson didn't really get as much room to breathe because of the heaviness of the record. On this album, he's allowed to sort of venture off a bit more with the keyboard work, especially, the pianos. And, they let him kind of weave more of a tapestry over the record. And it really shows on the title track, where we have this very keyboard-driven approach. And in fact, in the music video, I never claimed that music videos are the be-all, end-all of how a band is going to play the song live, but it's basically everybody in the band is playing keyboard, with a little bit of guitar work. I jokingly refer to the song a bit as Linkin Park of Salvation, because it does kind of have a very Linkin Park, Meteora-era sound to it. So, watch for that. The track might turn off a couple of fans, but again, it's like the rest of the singles. If you heard the singles and you're thinking, oh geez, this isn't going to be a very good album, you might want to give the rest of the album a chance. Speaking of the rest of the album, we have 2 tracks left, and it seems that they've saved the best for last. So Species is the next one on the list, and it's got a little bit more of a heaviness to it than the rest of the album. I think the keyboards, this is about the only song on the album where the keyboards really seem to have taken more of a back seat. And the approach that they're going for on this track is a little bit more of a bluesy, grungy kind of approach, like you would have heard on the Road Salt records. And it is a bit heavier. In fact, near the end, Daniel Gildenlow almost kind of launches into some screaming vocals. He's not necessarily a death metal singer at all, but he does start to get very animated in his vocal approach by the end of the track. I would say of the non-single tracks, this is probably my least favorite track, although I still love the song. I mean, it's a great song, but and it does have some vulgar lyrics. I mean, if you're into that sort of thing about, like, sometimes I hate my effing species, which is the line in the song that gets repeated the most, you might not be turned off by that, but, it does kind of come off a little angsty, and, I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get more into the lyrics of the record, but it does fit the theme. But taken on its own, out of context, I can see how some people might be turned off by it. So the final track on this record is by far the best song on the record, and I think that this is going to go down as a Pain of Salvation classic, very much in the same vein as many of their previous album closers. I can cite a few examples that this track really reminds me of right now. The Perfect Element, Beyond the Pale, In the Passing Light of Day. Enter Rain is a really good closing track for the band. And this has elements of all of those tracks, with this, really beautiful folky melody on the piano that opens it, launching into this more threatening heavy riff on the 7-string guitar, which is, this really heavy, fuzzed out guitar riff. And it leads you into thinking this is going to be like a really, really heavy song. But almost as soon as that riff has gone through a couple of repeats, you're kind of launched into this very pretty sounding section with, really beautiful pianos, really beautiful vocal melodies, and the chorus echoes that piano melody in the beginning, and, it just tugs at your heartstrings so much. And every once in a while, they kind of tease that heavy part by putting the little, lead guitar over it from that heavy part, distorted, and it kind of teases you into, oh, the heavy part's coming back in. And then it takes its time coming back in, and when it does, it launches into the first of the tracks to amazing guitar solos. These are the only like real like shred moments on the album. The one in Wait is just a very simple acoustic solo, but these are like full-on shred solos. And I know a lot of people kind of look at like guitar solos as overindulgent and sometimes even like unemotional, but these ones are just like, I don't know what notes he's hitting. I'd have to play it on my instrument to find out, but like it grips you right there. His playing the whole time is just so engaging and beautiful. And after that solo is finished, we get into this even more beautiful section than the first. Like, it's such a gorgeous melody and so designed to just break your heart. And the combination between the melody and the lyrics in this section, I like to think I'm fine. They rarely see me cry. I will admit to having a bit of a ball at the first time I heard that because it was just so powerful. It was so tugs at your heartstrings so much. And then, after this, they bring back the heavy section again, this time with a second guitar solo. I think the first one, I'm no expert on it, but the first one sounds like it's Daniel Gilmour playing, and then the second one sounds more like the style of Johan Hallgren, just from what I know of the two guitar players and how they play. So, we get into one of those moments where Johan busts out a little bit more of a noisy, angry solo, and again, it's just the way this track progresses over its 13 or so minutes is just masterful. And the way it closes out the album, just, you end up just a puddle after this album is finished. So, what else can I talk about? Well, there's the lyrical theme. Pain of Salvation, like every other band in the prog genre, is no stranger to concept records. And just about every album Pain of Salvation has ever released has been some form of a concept record, sometimes very narrative, very story-driven, sometimes just more of a general theme. And on this album, it's more of a general theme. The theme is sort of how society treats the neurodivergent. People with attention deficit disorder, people with, developmental issues. Daniel Gilmour himself was diagnosed with ADHD at some point during the process between his admission to the hospital for the flesh-eating bacteria that inspired In the Passing Light of Day, up to the process of recording and writing Panther. At some point in that time, he had been diagnosed ADHD. Several years back, he had a son born with Down syndrome. Nearly all of us in our lives have people that we know who have been diagnosed with things like depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, autism. And the way he tackles the topic on this album, there are moments where I could sort of see people looking at it controversially, such as a line in the song Panther where he talks about, maybe we're over-medicating people. But at the same time, in interviews, he's said that, it's not about being against medicating people who have disorders, but more like creating an environment for people with these neurodivergences to thrive. And I really like the metaphor he used in an interview where he mentioned that being neurodivergent is kind of being like the wrong kind of car. You would be like a Formula One race car where you're good at going fast and going through corners tightly. But if you take that out into a downtown core of a big city, you're going to have a terrible time driving a Formula One car. That's where a normal, economy car or minivan does the trick. But not everybody is a minivan or an economy car. Some of us are Formula One race cars, and we need to be put on a track to unleash our full potential. And there are moments on this album where he really does sort of address this kind of thing, like in the song Keen to a Fault. It's, from my own interpretation, kind of a song about his attention deficit disorder, how it's affected his relationships with others, and how, it sort of leads to him sort of not really being present because his brain is working on like 1,000 other issues at any given time. The line that really stood out to me is the opening line of the track, like, there's a spot on the ceiling, and if I look up at my ceiling right now, yeah, there's some spots that really catch my eye, and if I really let my attention stick to one of those, it can be devastating for me. So I completely understand where he's coming from on that. Accelerator is kind of a fantasy track about, like, what if all of us people who are neurodivergent and not normal just say, you know what, we get rid of all you normal people. It's our turn to run the world. We'll solve all the problems. The world's on fire, but we're the ones that gave you all of these, like, artists and scientists, and we gave you all of the most intelligent people. It's our turn. And I think there's going to be a few people who are going to look at that and think, like, okay, that might be a bit political. It really isn't, but I really like the approach. It's a very, very potent fantasy, and I think it kind of fits in with, the cover art, for one, which is very comic book inspired. So I kind of expected there to be a little bit of a fantasy element to the album, and I'm kind of glad how it played out on Accelerator. Panther kind of tackles the more, like, how do you know how it feels to be me kind of thing. Someone pleading with maybe someone they love or someone that they're engaged in a debate with about their state of mental health. And, and I think the people who are on the less neurodivergent end of the spectrum probably do wonder sometimes, like, how does it feel to be you? And, Daniel's response is, I feel like a panther trapped in a dog's world. Dogs are loyal and obedient and will follow commands, whereas cats don't give a f***. And, that's reflected in these lyrics. And then we get to Icon again, which, again, my favorite song on the album. I felt the lyrics in this, where I think it really talks about just the overall impression of, being neurodivergent and still trying to lead a life with a family, with, in Daniel's case, I guess, fame, fans, I followed you, now they follow me. And, lines talking about things like, looking at my friends and seeing the old version of them and, how do I mourn the living that are still here, but somehow gone. A line that really stuck with me from that track, as well as the, I must be doing fine, they rarely see me cry, is, when I was young, I felt too old, but now that I'm grown up, I feel too young. And I think there are going to be a lot of people on the neurodivergent end of the spectrum who are going to really relate to that. There's a lot of relatability on this album, which is, something Pain of Salvation has sort of strayed away from in the last few albums. I mean, In the Passing Light of Day was very personal, and I'm sure that there are a lot of people who have experienced similar things to Daniel on that track, but, it's still a very personal experience for him, whereas, like, Road Salt is this sort of interconnected bit of stories about decision-making, and it's a hard concept to follow. Scarsick is a scathing indictment of American culture and, just pop culture in general. And then you have B, which is Daniel's attempt to out pretentiousness every other prog band by creating a friggin' creation myth of an album. Like, I think the last time Daniel released an album that could be considered relatable was The Perfect Element Part 1, which has a lot of lyrics about, you know, broken homes and broken childhoods, abuse, sex, you know, loss, that kind of thing. And it feels like he really kind of brought that back a bit with this album in talking about a topic that's has become a lot more open in the time since, The Perfect Element Part 1. We're more open about talking about mental health nowadays. And I really applaud Daniel Gildenlow for bringing that topic to the forefront of this record, and by having a very diverse sort of a viewpoint of it. And, it's just fantastic. I think that there are going to be a lot of fans who are really going to find something to latch onto with this record. So my overall impression of this record is just that, the singles are the weakest tracks on the album. They're, by no means are they bad songs. They're all very wonderful pieces. But the real meat of this album is the non-single tracks. And the combination of the music and the lyrics on this record make it one of those rare cases where it's more than the sum of its parts. And I mean, it's just fantastic. Go check this album out. It is... I don't give scores like this very often, but I'd say it's easily a 10 out of 10 record. It's probably going to be my album of the year, and I'm going to be spinning especially the track Icon for a long time. It's probably up there with one of the best Pain of Salvation tracks, and Daniel, you did good. Anyway, thank you for watching this long-ass bastard of a review. I hope I covered everything. So, take care. We'll see you in the next one.
They rarely see me cry, but you were always on my mind.